Questions about that? Look at the tips to lower sodium. So these are really good things to have, 3 or 4 in your pocket, that when you're talking to a patient that's got high blood pressure and you perceive they're using a lot of salt, here are things you can recommend that they do. Now, salt, people get used to a certain taste of their food with salt, so moving people to lower salt is hard because it doesn't taste the same. If you eat your salt, if you salt your eggs and then you don't salt your eggs, it tastes a whole lot different. So buying fresh, plain frozen, canned, no salt vegetables. Okay. So fresh frozen is very comparable to fresh. So using those and then teaching patients what kinds of spices they could use or additives that will enhance the flavor but not add salt. Fresh poultry, fish, lean meat, rather than those that have been canned or processed. Remember the very first day we talked about, or second day, fresh. If they're going to say it's fresh, it has to meet certain criteria. Some of that is that they don't add salt to it. So having them look for that, telling them, okay, look for meat that says fresh on it. When Peggy was talking to you about, can you cut up a chicken? So buying your own chicken or processing ones you raise and knowing how to cut them up is a skill she feels has lost, but that would be a way to get fresh poultry. Using herbs, spices, salt-free, seasoned blends in cooking or at the table. Be careful though with your patients who are on medicines that raise their potassium. So salt substitutes, remember that salt is what? Potassium. So it's not a sodium chloride, it's potassium chloride. So it can give them hyperkalemia. Cook rice, pastas, hot cereals without salt. When I was growing up, my mother did that with everything. She boiled the water and throw the salt in. Usually, it didn't boil over then, or it made things taste better. So getting people to do that. No added salt. Don't add salt to a recipe. Choosing convenient foods that are low in sodium. Again, that's why I taught you those words, is you know now what it means. Low, reduced. So telling patients, look for those words because you know that they have a meaning that they can only use if they have met criteria. Okay? If you got to eat chips, do light, do baked, because they have less salt, less fat than regular. Cut back on frozen dinners if they can. Pizzas. Maybe teach them how to make their own. You can make a low sodium. You can make a vegetable pizza. You can make a pizza without a tomato sauce, which may have more sodium. Soups, broths, high in sodium. So they have to look for low sodium or sodium free. They taste terrible. But they can add back a little bit maybe. Rinse canned foods. So if they get canned vegetables, rinse them. That'll remove a lot of the salt. Tuna. Rinsing tuna. I don't know. Okay, so rinsing will get rid of salt. Buy low, reduced sodium, or no salt added versions of food. So that's why that comparison, that's where that label comes in and will help you. If they'll use something like MyFitnessPal where they can track the amount of sodium in foods, that may help them start to see how much sodium are they getting in a day. If they will move to fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, their sodium intake is going to go down. Or whole grains, their sodium content will go down. Processed foods, get rid of them. Or move them out, replace them. Talk to them about how to replace. Get them in with a dietitian to help them make good choices that are lasting. Okay, comments on those? We're almost done, hang in there. The TLC diet is a diet that was developed by the National Cholesterol Education Program. I love that group. I've known some of them. I like what they put out. They're very good in their science base. They endorsed a diet with the American Heart Association, which is more inclusive. It's a healthy diet. They use the DASH, or the low sodium DASH, weight loss, moderate alcohol, increase in activity. So it's more like, it's that holistic approach. So that diet's a piece, but it's not the entire piece. And that other things are complementary. So if you see the TLC diet, that's it. It's DASH plus alcohol, plus exercise, all together. Renal diets. I think these are the hardest diets for patients to adhere to. So every dialysis unit must have a dietitian, and they advise them, they work with them on this. Where I really find it's hard is when I've got a renal diet I'm trying to deal with and they are diabetic. That's really hard because what they've learned to do as a diabetic, a lot of the times the renal dietitian is going to tell them, don't do that. Don't eat fruits because they're high in potassium. So it takes a lot of coordination. I always make friends with the renal dietitian because I talk to them a lot about what they're doing or what they're seeing. When the patient goes to dialysis, they will give them a report card every so often. And it will give them all their lab. And they'll put happy faces where they're doing well, like what's their albumin, what's their sodium, what's their lipids, what's their glucose, what's their A1C, what's their calcium. And they'll bring them, they can bring them to you, and you can look at them. And then you'll know where they're having trouble and what they're being advised to do, because they may be advised to do stuff that you're not necessarily aware of. So be aware of, here's what they're having to do. They will be on those folks constantly, raise your protein, raise your protein, raise your protein. I've had some patients that really struggled with that because they couldn't afford it, or they weren't used to eating that much protein. So they need to eat high protein diets, usually at least 8 to 10 ounces of protein a day. Limiting potassium. So here's where a lot of patients have trouble because beans and fruits are high in potassium. So avoiding certain foods like bananas, dried fruit, nectarines, kiwis, prunes. Avoid potatoes, tomatoes, winter squash, and you see the list. Okay? In the African American community, that was hard because they tend to be big vegetable eaters. So that's a hard one for them to navigate. Don't use salt substitute. Light salt substitutes mean the same thing, they're all potassium. Limit salt. Okay, so you've limited potassium, you've limited salt. So their food tastes like crap. So working with them to get something that is meets their palate. Not salting during at the table or when they're cooking. Avoiding high salt foods. Again, it's processed foods, processed meats. They're usually prescribed. They have to limit their phosphorus. Remember, phosphorus and calcium. That ratio together tends to do what? If it gets too high, what happens?
Arrhythmias?
Pardon?
Arrhythmias?
No, not.
Oh.
Phosphorus and calcium bind together, they will precipitate out into the tissue. So we want to keep their ratio low. So they limit their milk. They will prescribe them binders, and those binders make them very constipated. So they're looking at Tums, Foslo, Renagel. Those are all phosphate binders. We talked about them in renal, if you want to go back and review. Fluids are based on, what a fluid balance, what they can excrete, because they all still will produce some urine. So that may go to what they can drink, the soups, more liquidy foods. The one place you really start to have trouble when you've got a diabetic who is with dialysis or pre-dialysis are the sweets. So I would look at these patients' diaries, or their blood glucose diaries, and on the day that they went to dialysis, it would spike. I'm like, what are you doing? So what they do is during dialysis, they sit out these big bowls of candy, and they tell them, eat all you want. So I've got blood sugars of 300 and 400 because they don't take their insulin because they usually don't eat. A lot of them don't eat before they go dialysis. And then I've got these sugars that are very high. So I've had to do a lot of communication about what they offer, but be aware of that. They really push the sugars so that they don't get hypoglycemic, and they can maintain at least some calorie intake while they're on dialysis. Questions about those? I want you to know those major areas, okay? It's important to have some sense of what they're being asked to do. Okay. Diabetes, So diabetes is, you're familiar with this, so this should be fairly easy. We don't have an abnormal diet that we require diabetics to do. A healthy diet and what they recommend in those guidelines is exactly what we want diabetics to do. Now, we may limit their carbs a little bit more, we may float their fats up a little bit more, but we want them to eat a healthy diet. They may have to limit fruits if their blood sugars are not well controlled. Low glycemic index, if there's something they can do that would, in terms of choosing. Fiber usually helps. High fiber foods usually tend to be low glycemic index foods. Everything else is pretty, vegetarian's a healthy option for them, vegan's a healthy option for them as well. Type 1's more incidence of celiac disease, so they may need a more gluten-free diet or a dietary consult to help them with that. Weight loss is almost always a problem here and things that you have to deal with. Using a plate, those portion control plates are really good. Plate method is good to promote for them. Okay, I'm going to go down to conditions and disease impact. I'll do that tomorrow, and we'll end with healthy heart. Okay, so with healthy heart, you're usually looking at DASH, would be a good one. The American Heart Association has some guidelines in terms of foods. They usually hit more the fats. They really promote less than 10% saturated fats and less than 30% fats for total calories. In the past, they've been more aggressive. They've gone down to less than like 20% fat, less than 7% saturated fat. For the most part, people cannot tolerate them. That's the Dean Ornish approach to diet, and it's just too hard. Most people will not sustain it long term. You'll have some folks that will, but the majority of patients can't tolerate it. The fat is too low. So promote healthy fats. Things that will, a Mediterranean diet would be good. A plant-based diet where they get fats through their vegetables. Upping their monounsaturated fat. All the things we've talked about, lowering their salt. That is what Heart Healthy is going to be looking at. Mostly fat content, salt content. Questions about those? Okay, so we'll be back from 1 to 3 with Peggy Turner for integral and parenteral, and then you'll be free to go after.